good afternoon and good morning to those of you joining us from the US, especially our speaker. And welcome to this art history in focus conversation in which we're going to hear about the significance and uses of colored stones in art and architecture from antiquity to early modern Europe. My name is Emanuela Tarizzo, and I'm a member of the board of London Art Week, the association of galleries that is hosting today's talk. Before I introduce our speakers, please note that this conversation is being recorded. It will be available on the London Art Week YouTube channel in due course, and it will last about 1 hour in total. And you can write questions, any questions you have for our speakers in the Q&A box which you'll find at the bottom of your Zoom screen. I will be monitoring this throughout the talk, and we will leave about 15 minutes at the end, 10-15 minutes for the questions, which I will be asking to the speakers. Now, it's my pleasure to introduce, first of all, Judy Mann, who has been curator of European art to 1800 at the St. Louis Museum of Art since 1997. She has curated exhibitions on Orazio and Artemisia Gentileschi, on Federico Barocci, on 16th and 17th century Italian sculpture, on medieval books of hours, and on Renaissance Nuremberg. In February 2022, next year, her latest project, her latest exhibition, which is what we're going to hear about today, is going to open at the St. Louis Art Museum. And the title is Paintings on Stone, Science and the Sacred 1530 to 1800. And the subject is the practice of painting on stone in early modern Europe. With Judy is Fabio Barry, who studied architecture at the University of Cambridge and briefly practiced before receiving his PhD at Cambridge University, his PhD in art history from Columbia University. He has taught at the University of St. Andrews and also more recently at Stanford University. And he's currently Samuel H. Kress Senior Fellow at the Center for Advanced Study in the Visual Arts at the National Gallery of Washington, D.C. His research has often concentrated on art in Rome, particularly Baroque architecture, but recent publications have ranged further afield and dwell on medieval and antique art, especially sculpture. His book, Painting in Stone, Architecture and the Poetics of Marble from Antiquity to the Enlightenment, was published by Yale University Press in 2020 and is the starting point of today's conversation. So, Fabio, over to you. You're on mute.
Sorry about that. Thanks very much. There's keep that slide, thanks. There's an exhibition that will be opening in February 2022, curated by Judy Mann, on paintings on stone, as you've heard. And so I'm just going to say, give you really a kind of short preamble about the context for that artistic practice, and in the process also just say a very few words about the book I wrote, which deals with this topic and which was published about a year ago, called Painting in Stone. Very confusing because the exhibition is called Paintings on Stone. And this isn't a short book. That's why I've got the table of contents up here. It's really quite lengthy. It deals with art over 5 millennia, from Mesopotamia to London. But the bulk of it is really about Italian art and architecture. It's not about marble as a prestige material or a token of a display of wealth and power. It deals primarily with 3 themes. The idea that light indwells in stone, that it has a sort of supernatural radiance, it's absorbed part of the sky, you might say, into it. It goes into the pre-modern understanding of geology and how this informed what I term a lithic imagination, whether the artists were working in sculpture, using the stone as a support for painting, but largely what I write about is architecture. So how this coloured medium enlivens the architecture, and how as a medium it also becomes a sort of common ground between these separate arts. And that brings me to the third idea, which is the one I'm going to tell you a bit more about, which is the idea that coloured marble was a natural species of painting, and therefore this trope painting in stone that appears in the title of the book, which is a thread throughout the European history, and not just European history, of coloured marble painting. Next, please. And this is a quotation from Pliny, and he was one of a host of Roman conservatives who all lamented rather loudly that the Roman aristocracy had begun to use coloured marbles in their homes and were riveting them from the floor to ceiling. And people like Seneca just hated this because they thought marble was a material that should really only be used in temples because of its radiance, and because and Pliny was an early ecologist who hated the idea of mountains being split up and the people delving into the bowels of the earth to bring all these marbles to Rome just so they could become ornaments in houses. But he particularly hated the idea that as marble became very common in domus or domestic interiors of the wealthy elites, that the marbled walls were actually not leaving any room anywhere for real painting. So if your house is marbled from top to bottom, there's nowhere to hang old masters, there's nowhere to hang your Apelles or something like that and learn from the example of classical art. So he said, he lamented that painting was dead because of coloured marble, and he said, we have now begun to paint in stone. And what he meant by this were things like this room you see on the right here in Herculaneum. You can see that's probably 6 or 7 feet high, that revetment there, where these exceptional marbles, Carystian, Chian, Docimian marble, so from the Eastern Mediterranean, were glued to the walls. And although that floor looks as though it's sort of pantile or something, quarry tile or something like that, that's actually marble too. And you have to imagine all of this shined up incredibly brightly, and this extraordinary sort of hypnotic interior. And the marble selected because they have this extremely brushy veining, and for the palette of the stones, all of which seem to compare marble to painting. And then also for the chance images that sometimes appeared in their veining, which is why I'm showing you this image on the left, where you can see this face just poking out of this imitation breccia. And that sort of pattern you'll just find painted ever after throughout the Middle Ages, the Renaissance, and so on. People were always seeing images in stone exactly the same way they would in cloud. Next, please. But it wasn't just, marble wasn't just prized for its veining alone in each slab. It was also cut into using a technique called opus interarsile, which you see in this pilaster capital below, or better known as opus sectile, which you see in this large panel of a lion devouring an antelope above. And this is what you might call a sort of large scale mosaic, really. You've got pieces of stone that are being, of coloured marbles, that are being selected for their veining and their shading, and then these are being used over some kind of pattern or template or cartoon. And what you end up with is this kind of petrified painting. And if the marble itself didn't have quite the right shading you wanted, then as with wooden marquetry, you'd take these pieces of stone and you would move them over a hot iron and you would get a deeper hue. And this allowed you to suggest volume and so on. And these techniques are very often used in conjunction, actually, ever afterwards. So marble in itself, a form of painting, cheek by jowl with intarsia. And if you want to know where the best example of this, the largest example of this is, best preserved, most extensive, then you have to go to Rome and see this room, which is the size of, a full-size squash court or something like that, from a domus at Ostia, the port of Rome. Next, please. Now I'm riding a kind of coach and horses through the history of this subject. So I'm going to miss out completely talking about the use of this in the Western Middle Ages and get straight to Byzantium, where again, we not only have some of the best preserved and most extensive examples of the use of the medium in architecture, but probably the most influential as well. And it's in Byzantium that, again, the veining, while they continue to use this intarsia technique, opus sectile, they really go crazy with this technique, which we call book matching, which this image on the left illustrates. So you can see a block of stone cut into slices, and then each of those slices of stone opened symmetrically, either in one direction to give you something that looks like the leaves of an open book, hence the name of the technique, or in again unfolded in another direction, and you end up with these typical kind of lozenge or X-shaped patterns that you get in the stone. And the writers who commended Byzantine architecture, all the poets who wrote rhapsodies talking about Byzantine churches and cathedrals as though they were actually things made by God himself, extol this kind of marbling as an example, or as rivaling the glories of painting, and fall back on this trope that begins with Pliny, that this is a natural form of painting produced by nature, the painter. And so here's and you can either see these things as individual images, or as a book matched image, or opened up accordion style, as here, to decorate the entire, to unfold potentially to infinite extension over the walls of the gallery in Hagia Sophia. Next, please. And of course, what this is most often being compared to is the images, when you look at book match marbles, the images you find with Rorschach ink blots. So if you see this, if you look at this piece of revetment from Ravenna here in the middle, you have this figure arising within the marble, which since at least the 16th century, again and again and again, people have recognized as some sort of Friar Tuck figure with a choir boy. It looks more like an alien to me, but a choir boy in front of him and his hands on his shoulders and that sort of thing. Interestingly enough, Byzantine literature hardly ever, I mean really hardly ever at all, speaks about images arising, in images of figures like this, arising from book match marble in the way that we expect them to retroactively. And what they tend to talk about a bit more, as in the example on the right, is the image of the substance of the marble itself that arises from its own image. So in this case, this is the floor of Hagia Sophia, which for generations, if not centuries, was compared to a frozen sea. And the symmetries here of the book match marbles just accentuated the idea that this kind of rippling veining in the stone looked like waves. And the reason to believe this, or to make this kind of, have this kind of perception, was the part of ancient geology that believed that stones themselves were kind of liquid brews, that water that percolated down through the rock, taking stone particles with it, and then had kind of frozen solid in the bowels of the earth, and then could be much, much later on sliced up to make veneers. And then when one laid them over the floor of the church, it was as though one strode across the waters of creation, so to speak. Next, please. Now, again, skipping forward centuries, the use of marble as a medium never really stops, but the supplies of it are always dwindling. In the old Eastern Empire in Byzantium, there were stocks of marbles that could still be used. In the West, what tended to happen was that buildings were spoliated for marble as a raw material. Rome itself became a huge quarry. And it's not really until the 16th century that industrial scale quarrying, if one can call it that, quarrying of new marbles begins again. And it's not until the last decades of the 16th century that we find an interest also in large workshops that are going to make tabletops, portraits, as you see here, even entire buildings. And partly this is an initiative of the Archducal Court in Florence and the establishment of the Galleria dei Lavori, or what's known today as the Opificio delle Pietre Dure in Rome. And these new kind of confections in stone, which is obviously a revival of what I showed you earlier, the opus sectile of antiquity, were called by their makers and by their patrons eternal paintings, and also paintings in stone. So picking up ideas that have been around for centuries. And it was even argued that the person who made an intarsia like this was even more skillful than a painter, because you required even better judgments to choose the stones, and even better skill to blend them into these new petrified paintings. And these were eternal, whether it was a vase of flowers that wasn't going to wilt, as you can see in this tabletop on the left, or a person whose true portrait would remain fixed for eternity, as you see on the right. And it's really in this kind of context that Judy's show about paintings on stone fits most closely. And I won't say a word about that because she's going to show us several examples. Next slide, please. I want to leap forward and show you the kind of, for me, the sort of culminating glory of this tradition, which is Bernini's Cornaro Chapel in Rome. And if you look at this, the whole thing now is a painting. The chapel seems a painting, and it's really using this painterly medium that allows it to achieve that effect. When you look at these walls, you don't see marble panels inserted into revetment. It's as though you're looking at clouds move. The wall seems to become a sort of transparent fog. And if you look from bottom to top, there's this gradual transition from the place of the altar and the burial vault, because this chapel, like most other chapels in Rome, is a funerary chapel, and all the way up to the vault where these fresco clouds, and remember, fresco itself is also a synthetic form of colored stone, where the clouds themselves seem to roll back so you can see the Almighty. And it's not just painterly in appearance, but the color goes from this kind of muddy and browny registers at the bottom through these kind of autumnal hints until you get, it becomes ever more nebulous and light-filled. And it's as though the sculptor here, Bernini, isn't just painting with the stones, it's as though he's painting with the elements themselves, which is why I've got the 4 samples on the right here to show you stones that look variously from the bottom up, more earthy, more fiery, more watery, and more airy. And the net result of all this also is that in the middle of this extraordinary constructed painting, which is almost like a phase change as well, from a solid to gas, from earth to ether, you see the statue of the white Saint Tarizzo. She's substanceless, like her own soul, floating on a cloud bank up to meet the Almighty off stage above the light-filled clouds at the top. And all of this is a kind of convincing ensemble, because it's the ability for every part of this, whether it's the sculpture or the architecture, to be inherently painted, so to impersonate painting, that allows this to work all together as a vision. And I will conclude, next please, by saying that these sort of innovations, this long tradition of using marble as a form of painting, doesn't conclude in the 18th century, but it's where I'm going to stop. It's where my book really concludes, even though it has an epilogue, in the sort of the kaleidoscopic cloud architecture that you get north of the Alps, in Bavaria, Bohemia, and beyond. And if you look at these Baroque and Rococo interiors up there, there are no marbles here. These are actually what looks like marble is fashioned from a stucco lustro or stuckmarmor, or what's very often called scagliola in this country. And this is actually anhydrite that has been leavened with bone glue, kneaded with coloured earths, as you can see at the top here, into a marbleized loaf, as you can see in the middle, and then that's finally sliced into veneers, which you can compose and dispose à plaisir, as you can see with this gentleman down here, with a result that you have interiors that look something between marble and cloud, and of course are neither, and that the craftsmen here are again simulating nature. They're making a kind of stone, they're doing it from fantasy, and the clouds they make here are not carved, they're not modeled, they are patterned inherently within the material, in that sense they seem to be painted in stone. Over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Fabio. And Judy.
Yes, thank you. Yes, there is such a lovely meshing of these two projects, because my book or my catalog could sort of fit in between pages like 300 and 304 within Fabio's book, and it would make sense there. So could I have the next slide? Just showing you the catalog, so you'll recognize it at your local bookstore if you want to buy it. So my project started with this Cavaliere d'Arpino Giuseppe Cesare's Perseus rescuing Andromeda on the left, made fashioned from lapis lazuli. And the museum bought this, the only time we had at that point bought work at auction in Old Master. And I bought it, as you put together an auction bid, one often works very quickly. So I really didn't know what I was buying. I didn't know very much about the practice of painting on stone, but I thought in my mind, I put it actually in the context of Fabio's book, the idea of these splendid revetments, the Pauline and Sistine chapels in Santa Maria Maggiore, and I thought it was an offshoot of that taste and desire for these richly marbled interiors. But over the next few years, we bought it in 2000, and then I began to really think about it and do some more reading, and realizing that it is a thing unto itself as well, and got quite interested in it as I was researching it, constantly being told by people that they knew nothing about it. So it seemed that this was something that would be a worthy exhibition idea. And so as I further researched this particular painting, which I think most agree, Herwarth Röttgen puts it in 1593-94. So it is at this moment when artists are changing from the practice that's really put into place systematically by Sebastiano del Piombo. I mean, most studies of painting on stone really go back and look at ancient examples, and there are periodic attempts, but this is more sort of a systematic usage of stone and appreciation of stone as a support for painted imagery, I think really grows out of this kind of competitive atmosphere in early 16th century Rome, and Sebastiano himself not quite as wedded to some of the techniques that Tuscan artists would have been more wedded to. So he experiments, other artists were experimenting with it as well, but his formula perhaps stuck better. So there is for the most of the, so from around 1530 to the 1580s and into the 90s, artists are using stone, and in general, not always, but in general, covering the stone. It is not a visual property of the stone. It is the presence of the stone that seems to add or imbue the imagery with greater resonance and greater meaning. And as I was working on the show, what I began to become more interested in, I thought it would be a better way to mount an exhibition, was really how they utilized the stone. Once artists in the 1590s began to really respond to and incorporate aspects of the surface of the stone, that would make a kind of interesting show for a general public. My initial efforts had been to sort of track down a lot of artists who did specialize in stone, and frankly, a lot of them were pretty boring. And I realized that, you know, to do a sort of survey of it wouldn't be quite as engaging. But it turns out that the moment that this Perseus painting was made, this is the second of about 12 or 14 versions that Cavaliere d'Arpino made of the Perseus and Andromeda, and he made it on almost every support we know, on panel, on canvas, on copper, on agate, on pietra paesina, and lapis lazuli and slate. The first version, which is shown to you on the right, is on slate. And interestingly enough, in the second version, the lapis version, Cavaliere d'Arpino responds to the stone, not simply in terms of the inherent qualities of the stone, the calcite occlusions, or the pyrite that appears, the little golden shower, but actually to the split in the stone, the crack that was there from the very beginning. And he took his Andromeda from the slate version on the right, where her right leg holds her weight, and he changed it to making the left leg the weight-bearing leg, so he could pull up that leg and therefore align it more easily along the crack. So it becomes a very clear recognition that artists are in fact responding to the stone before them. And I think this marks a moment where Cavaliere d'Arpino himself had a kind of revelatory experience when he was working in the, now I'm going to blank on the name, chapel in Santa Prudenziana. And he was working with he was doing the dome fresco, but he was also working with an altarpiece of slate, and he recognized the power of seeing imagery on stone, understanding imagery on stone, and then seeing it juxtaposed to imagery that was not on stone. It's a visceral, sort of profound experience, and I think he carried that over into his non-religious work as well.
I think you're suddenly muted.
Did, okay, sorry. Next slide, please.
Next slide.
So what I'm going to show you, really, it's a sort of shameless appeal for you to want to see the exhibition, but some of the really interesting issues that a number of the paintings present to us. And really, this exhibition is just a very beginning, and I don't fail to recognize some of the really fabulous work that was done before me. So I'm just indicating that there's still a great deal of work to be undertaken in terms of understanding painting on stone, including its use and prevalence in Flanders, because that is the area where white marble is most often used, or white stones. In this case, we have an alabaster. But also, interestingly enough, when I began working on the project, it was the sort of clear conviction of many scholars that really the most important idea behind the development of painting on stone was the paragone, the competition between painting and sculpture. And obviously here, with the material of sculpture and the act of painting, it makes an interesting contribution to that sort of ongoing discussion. But few examples really address that sort of firmly head on, including this one. We don't really know the artist. It seems to come from a follower of Van Balen in Antwerp, this Bathsheba, where the sculpture and the piazza itself are actually of stone. So you have both painting and stone sculpture within the same work. Next slide. So many of these works, my contention in understanding paintings on stone is not necessarily that every time an artist takes up a piece of stone, the intention is to achieve a certain amount of meaning. But when stone is used, it certainly conveys a great many sort of layers of meaning and resonance. And this Cantarini painting is a case in point. On this Egyptian alabaster, this wonderful piece where you can see there's a kind of electrifying aspect to it already. So the idea of a kind of heavenly realm is communicated to us. Obviously, the artist is looking at the Annibale Carracci, probably, and I'm sorry, I've spelled Carracci wrong, I see. Probably, if not the painting itself, although probably would have known it, a print, and which would account for the reverse imagery. And so this idea, we see it a lot in paintings on stone, the replication of famous images, well-known images. So there's a riff on Annibale Carracci and also a reference quite clearly to Michelangelo's sculpture. So the idea of a painted sculpture and painting and sculpture, and the whole idea of stone, the sarcophagus behind now is actually stone that is referenced and represented in the Annibale version. But also this lavish use of lapis lazuli in the coloration of the Virgin's robe. So this idea of a ground stone that has been applied to the surface. So the kind of multivalent meanings and references here make it an extraordinarily rich image. Next slide. Next slide. Oh, go back, sorry. Yeah. Certainly when I was putting together the slides I was going to show, I was thinking about Fabio and some of his responses and the stones he was thinking about. Amethyst is, or purple quartz, is really utilized a lot. I think it hasn't been recognized. It is usually used in conjunction with a piece of slate, probably either painted red or gilded. In this case of the Filippo Lowry, it is gilded, and hence it provides this marvelous sense of the miraculous, of the sort of skies being transformed by the appearance of the Holy Spirit, and it sort of infuses the sky. And a lot of stones, often very actively colored stones, are utilized for imagery that does denote the sort of presence of the divine, or some sort of transformative intrusion of the divine realm. And just in reading Fabio's book, I copied the Ascanio Valentino's reference to amethyst and water. Again, that's whether we know that Lowry, or if this was done for a patron, whether they understood or were aware of that kind of discourse about amethyst. Once you know it, it certainly makes the image more resonant. Emanuela, the next one, please. This is probably one of the most important images in the show. Early on, I've been working on this project so long, early on, this was a lost image. Italian writers who were writing about it knew of the existence of this, that Sigismondo Ler had done these marvelous paintings on stone, but it wasn't, its location only became known later in the 90s to scholars in the Real Monasterio de la Encarnacion in Madrid. And this speaks to so many things. I mean, I love the idea that we have this sort of grade C artist who's totally taking his cues from the piece of agate on which he's working. And hence a kind of, on the left, the image of the Annunciation, the Virgin is kind of shoved off to her little corner. She's still there, but he utilizes these beautiful bandings to create this sense of the sort of divine intervention. But also this notion of the translucency of alabaster. Now, many stones, as Fabio's already talked about, the understanding of light and the penetration of light, but particularly in an image of the Annunciation, this idea of a metaphor for the Virgin's sort of becoming pregnant in this divine fashion. So there are a number of images of the Annunciation that utilize this translucent stone, whether it's agate or alabaster. Emanuela, next. The use of a colored marble for Tempesta. Antonio Tempesta is really the go-to guy when it comes to the making of attributions. If you have a painting on stone and it's figurative and it engages with the surface of the stone and you don't know who made it, chances are it'll be called a Tempesta. And I'll end with this, but what's so interesting with Tempesta is that he really does, and I think more than any artist that I have seen in the ones that we looked at, he really takes the stone, but he modifies the stone to satisfy his needs. So the painting that will be in the exhibition is the one from Budapest there on the left, and so that's why I've reproduced it in a larger format. Unfortunately, the red marble, there's really no such thing as red marble. That's why we have the quotations. That's the nomenclature that's generally used. That example was not available to us for the exhibition. It's too bad, because obviously the red sea and the red marble would be perfect. But in the one on the lower right, that's in the Giullini collection in Milan, there, just all over the place, Tempesta has added extra striations in the surface of the alabaster to enhance the differentiation between the foreground waters and the other parts of the stone to sort of suit his pictorial purposes. So in a certain way, there is this artist working together with nature or with God, truly, because he's amending the stone he's working with. I'll just, Emanuela, the last one, I won't talk about it so much, but just because it's such a wonderful example, because I know my time, I think I've overrun.
No, we're fine. We're fine.
Oh, are we? Good.
Yes.
So Tempesta, Tempesta is not the most creative artist when it comes to painting on stone. That title goes to the French artist Jacques Stella, but nonetheless, he uses a variety of stones and really has probably the most balanced approach to taking his cues from the stone, but yet, as I've already pointed out, not being determined by the stone, and he will add as necessary if there isn't, as in the case of these two hunting scenes, when he needed more trees or more sort of dendritic forms, he added them as necessary to make these marvelous panels, which are in the Kunsthistorischen Museum. So All right, I think that's.
Thank you both. And I'm just going to stop sharing my screen so that our audience can see you both together. And for the Q&A section, we have, I mean, first of all, I was going to ask Fabio, just out of curiosity, this is probably silly, but do we know of any paintings on stone in antiquity, sort of before the period that, you know, Judy's exhibition talks about? You're on mute.
Sorry. Yes, we do. So the ones that immediately come to mind are panels from Herculaneum, which are in the National Museum in Naples, which became already quite famous in the 18th century. So actually after the period when most of Judy's paintings are being painted. And they were, I mean, they were quite important because when they were discovered, they were adduced by antiquarians as being an example of what Pliny might have meant. People who thought that he wasn't talking metaphorically, but was actually talking about people painting on stones. So there's some beautiful paintings of centaurs, there's of women playing knuckle bones, things like that. And they're painted in kind of sanguine tones on white marble. On white, yeah. And there are those. There are also some tombstones. So if you go to Istanbul, you'll find in the archaeological museum, you'll find white stones where the veining's been painted on them, but in a very kind of cartoonish way to sort of, you know, to upgrade the marble to something more fancy. Judy, I think you're going to say something.
Yeah, I just, the Prado did a small show featuring their fabulous Titian on slate, and they made the argument that that Titian may have known some of that, either the ones in Naples or something similar to that. So it's unclear. You know, again, earlier there was a kind of assumption that one of the reasons behind painting on stone was to emulate the ancients, and that these paintings were known and people were doing that. But as Fabio's just pointed out, they're all on white marble, and artists in Italy in general are not using white marble. In fact, Titian does. Titian, interestingly, does.
But there are very few of them as well. There's only 3 of these slabs in Naples.
Yeah, right.
And they I mean, we know the day they were discovered. So Titian couldn't have seen those, but what Titian could have known is that slate was used as a backing for inlay and also for emblemata in mosaic. If he needed to actually know an ancient example, he just didn't use slate because it's a support that resists humidity. Actually, can I ask you a question, Judy? Sorry, just while I've got the mic. I was really interested in what you just said about the veining in the stone being accentuated, because in one of the examples, because most of the time we tend to think the veining's there. A vein in alabaster can be used for the profile of a cloud or something like that. But it seemed that you were suggesting that actually the veining was accentuated, or the veining was made more complicated as veining. Is that right?
Yes. Yes, absolutely. Now, whether I don't think I've discovered it in others examples beside Tempesta, but I wouldn't rule it out. A lot of times it is, unless you have the opportunity to examine these things in a lab where you can really look at them from the side, sometimes you can't, it's not clear what you're seeing. So I think, actually, I think Orazio Gentileschi, too, it's unclear whether he's enhancing the striations in the stone or whether it's just part of the painting. So that's another complication. But in Tempesta's case, very clearly he is adding on to the veining to create.
Right. Fantastic. Yeah. Which is a technique, is analogous to a technique that's used in revelment as well, and was forever and a day, which was either you can get pieces that were large enough or their veining was just too boring. So marble workers would basically cut out the tedious bits and add in a bit of veining from another slab. to make it more interesting. So again, it's a cognate technique. Anyway, back to Emanuela. Sorry.
No, thank you. No, it's fascinating. And I was also actually thinking about this kind of enhancing the stone and how that would have been, whether it was, with the kind of, there was a sense of the stone, the sacredness of the stone, probably earlier on. And it's interesting that they actually then go and modify it to an extent. We have lots of questions about the techniques of painting on stone, and obviously we have questions about how was stone prepared in order to have the oil paint adhere onto it, and also questions about it says furability. I believe that's what's been typed. I believe it means future prospects for conservation, I guess. So, and I think that's interesting also, thinking about how, Fabio was mentioning how painting in stone is seen as something eternal, and obviously paint is more ephemeral than the actual stone. So when you put the two together, but if you want to start from maybe the techniques.
Well, it has to do with heating the stone, as I understand it. Interestingly enough, marble is used so little, but paint sticks to it very, very well. And you don't get too many examples. What's fascinated me, and we have someone who worked on technique for the catalog, but in Verona, where there is a whole school that develops based on some, it's a kind of slate, but not identical to the Genoese slate, or properly called Lavagna in Italian, that's discovered around 1580. And therefore it sort of inspires a local school of artists who not specialize in stone, but certainly do a lot of it on slate. In general, except for Turkey, their process wasn't very good. And if you go to Verona to see the museum, you'll see huge losses, just major losses. So where Sebastiano del Piombo's work has held up very well, to the extent that the one of his altarpieces was damaged during the Spanish Civil War. I think, if not by guns, by swords, and it's very tenuous. But the paint stuck. I mean, there was some loss clearly, but so anyway, that the technique isn't all that unusual, but it, I think, does have to do with properly preparing and heating the stone to give, and this is more about slate. Again, we get very excited about all of the beautiful stones that are used, but in point of fact, I think 60% or more are slate. I mean, it was, there's that practical side of availability, I think.
And I think availability is another really interesting point, and also in terms of how resistant the stone is. There's a question about was it not a risk of flaking on some stone types, which I'm sure there might have been. I don't know if you'd like to add. And Juliette is asking, so you must paint while the stone is still hot? Sure.
I should know that. I don't, but that's my understanding. Yeah.
We should have had a conservator as well. I think we should have completed the panel with a conservator or a painter.
Right. But yes, the danger of flaking is huge, and hence why they are difficult loans to get, because people are nervous about that. But as I said, on marble, it seems like very little problem there, very receptive.
Mm-hmm. Fabio, would you like to add anything?
I don't really, that's not a technique I've tried myself. No, the only thing I should add, but I don't want to take us off in another direction particularly, is that there's another type of painting on stone which was only used by very, very few practitioners, which was actually to try and chemically infuse the stone with an image. So make a pigment that would sink into it. And I think I am aware of perhaps, I'm aware of, I don't know, 30 or 40 examples that were painted. But
what period? And sort of
17th century, but into the 18th century as well. And but there's only two that I'm aware survive, and one's in Siena and one's in Rome. So
they have something of the sort of alchemical in terms of.
Yeah, it's a kind of mysterious technique, and a recipe was published for it, and I read about this some time ago, and actually I've always been looking for somebody to try and reproduce it. So maybe when I eventually get to the National Gallery, I'll find a willing hand there. But there's certainly a recipe for it, but it's very rare. So it's you know it's a curio compared to the kind of things Judy's been talking about.
Mm-hmm. And we have another question about the Polari baptism, and I was actually interested in it because when you showed it, obviously it's beautiful, and it's also its frame, which I do. So correct me if I'm wrong. Is it original to the painting?
I don't think it is. I don't think it is, but that is a sort of style of frame that was popular. But I don't know categorically that.
We don't. It's difficult. It's not always possible to know whether a frame is original, but in that particular case, obviously, you're putting together, in a sense, painting on stone and painting in stone with the frame. You're creating both. And the question was, what materials went into the frame? Are those gemstones? I don't know if we. I think I could probably find it for you and go back to it, but.
Well, there's certainly lapis in the frame, and I think is it maybe coral as well? I'm trying to
share my screen.
I think we have a proper description of it, but I don't think I've committed it to memory. Yeah,
it seems like there's obviously it's inlaid with metal as well, on the or silver,
right. Little sort of well, yes, edged silver with ebony. I think is, you know, I mean, there's a lot of contradictory information because we do have references to these being kept in drawers, taken out, not necessarily on display all the time. Of course, then there's the use in the Kunstkammer, but some ones that bear frames that we thought were original, now we've discovered are not, and we're not entirely sure how they were handled and used, or whether they were always framed for the kind of presentation that we expect today.
Let me just stop my screen share so we go back to the two of you. And could you, this is just something, because it was mentioned, and I know that I think you both talk about it in the catalogue of the exhibition and in your book, that the sort of the supply of these materials and the trade in them in early modern Europe, especially because that's a period which you both cover. I don't know if you'd like to add anything about that.
Shall I say? Okay. Well, I mean, Italy is forever past a certain point starts prospecting more and more different kinds of stone, but you know, initially the marble that they're bringing up is, of course, sort of white statuary marble. So it requires a bit of a kind of change in taste to actually go looking for veined stones. And as far as painting paintings or producing intarsia, there was enough basically spolia lying around that you didn't need to go and quarry marbles on a large scale. It's once there's a taste for inherently polychrome building that this really picks up and then becomes quite swiftly pan-European with a particularly important place being, again, Flanders, not only for the white marbles Judy is referring to as well, but also for Pietra di Paragone, you know, the black marbles, whether as a painting sport or for intarsia. It doesn't come in really large enough sizes to use for large architectural members. So that's my initial response to your question.
Yeah, I mean, I think, I mean, they're certainly getting it from Sicily and Africa and in the Middle East and Afghanistan. But the availability. I think the fact that Cavalieri d'Arpino was able to make that little panel they made, it's a bit unusual because it's a single piece with a split in it, but nonetheless a single piece. Most of them are sort of made like book match, I mean, or in butterflied or things and pieced together. But I think that there was the availability under Clement the Eighth to have large sheets of this or larger sheets than one might normally expect. And that gave him the opportunity to paint such a painting. I mean, lapis lazuli is not rare as a painting support, but it certainly doesn't come very large.
Thank you. I don't know if you'd like to add anything else. You've been absolutely wonderful with your timing. So we are absolutely on time. But if you'd like to add anything else, otherwise, thank you both. And thank you to our audience for your questions. I think maybe I could just remind everybody that this talk is going to be available on YouTube on the London Art Week channel in due course, and the exhibition at the St. Louis Art Museum of Art opens in February 2022 on the 20th, if I'm not mistaken. You said, yes. Judy, yes. And obviously Fabio's book is available, published by Yale University, and by all means, visit and buy the.
Right, and put in a plug for Fabio's book is fabulous. You should buy it. It made me really regret that I no longer teach Hagia Sophia because I just think the chapter on Hagia Sophia, chapters really are extraordinary. So it's really an enjoyable piece of scholarship. So well
Great.
Done, Fabio.
Thank you. So, for which I have to say, buy Judy's catalogue as well, because that's available in the shops. Generally next to mine.
Both, so that they complement each other, as we've just seen. So absolutely. Okay. Well, thank you both very much, and thank you to our audience. And have a good evening or afternoon in the States.
Bye.
Bye bye.
Bye bye.